The second sniper fell without a sound, 300 yards upslope in darkness so complete her night vision showed only gray static and the faint heat bloom where his body had been. She didn't wait to confirm the kill. The shot pattern told her there were 3 more, and the clock in her head said 4 to 2 minutes until first light, 4 to 2 minutes before the convoy would have to move through the kill zone these shooters had spent all night perfecting. She adjusted her position behind the boulder, breath controlled, and rechecked the range card taped inside her sleeve. The small waterproof notebook showed angles and timing she'd logged over the past hour, shot intervals, muzzle flash positions, the predictable rhythm enemy snipers used to coordinate without radio. The SEALs pinned 200 yards behind her had stopped returning fire 10 minutes ago, which meant they'd accepted the standing order. Wait for dawn. Don't chase ghosts in the dark. Let air support handle it when there's light to see by. But dawn was when the convoy died. She'd told them that. Twice. The helmet cam attached to her rail captured everything. Her sight picture, the whispered count under her breath, the way her glove hand moved from notebook to rifle without hesitation. Later, that footage would matter. Right now, it just added 4 ounces she didn't need and made her more visible if the enemy had thermals. A crack echoed across the valley. Not at her, but probing for the SEAL's position. She counted. 7 seconds. Another shot, different angle. The remaining snipers were adjusting their pattern because 2 of their team had gone silent. They knew someone was hunting them now, which meant they'd change timing to break her predictions and compress the usable window she had left. Somewhere behind her, radio traffic crackled with confusion. Command didn't know she'd left the observation post. They would soon. Her absence from the wall and the sudden shift in enemy fire toward her last muzzle flash would show up in sensor logs, and then the real clock would start. Not just dawn, but the countdown to court-martial for an authorized movement beyond the perimeter under darkness. She moved laterally, staying below the ridgeline, ignoring the regulation that said she wasn't supposed to be here at all. 6 hours earlier, the platoon chief had looked at her across the briefing tent with the expression of someone explaining physics to a child. "Your radio and intel," he'd said, tapping the tablet in front of her. "That means you sit at the forward OP, you watch the drone feeds, and you call it in if anything moves. You do not," he paused for emphasis, "leave the wire to freelance. Play." She'd nodded. Behind him, 3 SEALs were gearing up, checking rifles, trading the kind of casual insults that meant they trusted each other completely and trusted her not at all. She'd been attached to the team for 6 weeks, long enough to map their patterns and not long enough to break the category they'd assigned her: support. Analyst. The person who handed them information but didn't use it herself. "I've got a pattern," she'd said anyway, keeping her voice flat. Enemy snipers have been tightening their bracket over the past 3 nights. They're not random harassment anymore. They're zeroing the convoy route for a coordinated strike right before dawn. The chief glanced at her report, the one she'd submitted yesterday with timestamps, angle calculations, and a recommendation for proactive counter-sniper movement under darkness. He'd stamped it reviewed, not actionable at night, and moved on. "Interesting analysis," he said now, in a tone that meant academic and irrelevant. "But we don't hunt snipers in the dark. SOP says we sit tight, mark positions, and let air assets clean them up at first light. Your job is to feed us data, not play operator." She'd brought her rifle anyway. A custom precision setup, she'd zeroed herself on 3 different ranges. When the chief saw it during final gear check, he'd laughed. "Planning to shoot from the OP?" he asked. "If I need to." "You won't." He waved her through. "But whatever makes you feel better. Comfort item." The youngest SEAL loading magazines nearby had snorted. "She's been scanning and counting all week, man. Nerves." The chief shrugged. "Long as she stays on the radio, I don't care if she knits." She'd forced herself not to respond, knowing that pushing back would only cement their judgment. Instead, she'd double-checked her notebook, a small waterproof field log where she'd been manually recording every shot pattern the enemy used, every gap in their timing, every blind spot the drone coverage missed due to terrain and battery limits. The comms officer had seen her logging entries and raised an eyebrow. "You know the system tracks all that automatically, right?" "I know. So why the handwritten backup?" Because no one looks at automated logs until after people die, she thought. Out loud, she said, redundancy. He'd shrugged and moved on, leaving her with a notebook and the growing certainty that her warnings wouldn't be acted on in time. The mission timeline was locked around a dawn convoy departure that couldn't be delayed, part of a larger joint operation across 3 districts that would cascade into failure if any piece shifted. Leadership had chosen the schedule over flexibility, which meant the clock was already set and nothing she said would change it. At 0200, the sniper fire had started exactly as she'd predicted. She'd stayed at the observation post for the first 30 minutes, following orders, watching the enemy pattern develop through her optics and matching it against her notes. 2 muzzle flashes from the ridgeline, coordinated with a third from a depression she'd marked as a probable height 3 nights ago. The shots weren't aimed to kill, yet. They were ranging shots, adjustments, the kind of prep work snipers did when they knew exactly when their target would move and wanted to make sure they didn't miss. She called it in. Hostile sniper activity. 3 confirmed positions. Grid follows. Copy, command replied. Log and hold position. We'll review at first light. They're not going to wait for first light, she said, keeping her voice level. This is prep fire for dawn. If we don't disrupt them now. Negative. IOE is clear. Observe and report. No unauthorized movement beyond perimeter at night. You're there to feed data, not chase ghosts. She'd logged it. Watched the next sequence of shots. Updated her notebook with refined angles. The enemy snipers were using terrain folds the drone couldn't see into, repositioning slightly after each probe, tightening their net. 20 minutes later, one of the SEAL elements had been ordered to test enemy response by moving forward to probe. The lead operator took a round through the shoulder before he'd gone 10 yards. The radio erupted with casualty reports and demands for medevac coordination, which meant vehicle movement, which meant exposing more people to the same sniper net that had just proven it was locked and ready. She'd updated her notebook, could have moved on position 125 minutes ago, approach corridor clear, shooter not yet zeroed. Now the approach was harder. The enemy had refined their firing solutions, and the convoy prep was underway, which meant the clock had tightened further. She made one more attempt. Request permission to move on grid. Denied. Stay on the wall. That's an order. The SEAL she'd been working next to, the one who'd called her counting a nervous tick, glanced over. They're not going to let you go out there. I know. So why do you keep asking? Because in 40 minutes they're going to send that convoy straight into 5 pre-zeroed firing lanes, and someone needs to do something about it. He looked at her for a long moment, then went back to watching his sector, clearly deciding it wasn't his problem. She stayed on the wall for another 10 minutes, watching the enemy snipers adjust again, watching command decide to delay the medevac until after convoy movement because shifting the timeline would break the larger operation. Every decision they made bought institutional coherence at the cost of tactical sense, and every minute of obedience she gave them made the situation worse. A sniper round clipped the antenna array attached to the convoy staging point, a shot so precise it couldn't have been luck. They weren't harassing anymore. They were demonstrating readiness. She looked at her notebook, at the patterns, at the blind ridge she'd marked as the anchor point for the enemy net, the position that let them coordinate everything else. Getting to that ridge from here, in the dark, with enemy overwatch, would take most of the time she had left. Command wasn't going to change course. The SEALs were doing what they'd been trained to do: follow orders, trust the system, wait for support. She pulled her rifle close and quietly cut her MIC. The perimeter was 60 yards of open ground to the first terrain fold. She moved through it in a low crawl, using a depression she'd memorized during daylight, keeping her profile below the sight line she'd calculated in her notebook. Her helmet cam captured the slow traverse, rock, dirt, the faint gray shapes of brush in night vision, her breathing controlled to near silence. No one called after her. Either they hadn't noticed yet, or they'd assumed she was repositioning within the perimeter. The first sniper fired again, not at her, still probing the SEAL's position. She counted the interval. 7 seconds to the next shot, different angle. That meant at least 2 shooters were still coordinating timing, which told her the enemy net was intact enough to function but disrupted enough to be searching for threats. She checked her notebook, cross-referenced the sound angles, and adjusted her course toward the ridge. The route she'd chosen was longer but used low ground the snipers couldn't observe without exposing themselves. It added time she didn't have, but it kept her invisible long enough to matter. Her helmet cam recorded everything. Each decision, each pause to check angles, the whispered count under her breath as she tracked shot rhythms. She knew what this footage would look like later, proof of deliberate planning or proof of reckless disobedience, depending on who watched it and what they wanted to see. The climb to the ridge took 18 minutes. She reached the final approach with less than half an hour to dawn, which meant the convoy was already starting pre-movement checks. If she didn't collapse the sniper net now, she wouldn't make it back in time to stop the launch. She settled into a firing position behind a cluster of rocks and scanned for the anchor sniper, the one who coordinated the others, the one whose position let him see both the convoy route and the other hides. Her notes said he'd be north-northwest, elevated, using a crack in the ridgeline that gave him a natural loophole. A muzzle flash bloomed exactly where she'd predicted. She didn't aim at the flash. She aimed at where he'd move after firing, based on the timing pattern she'd logged. 3 seconds. She squeezed the trigger. The sound cracked across the valley, and somewhere in the dark, the third sniper stopped moving. Immediately, the remaining two shifted fire toward her position. Rounds snapped past, close enough that she heard the supersonic crack before the report. They knew someone was hunting them now, and they were coordinating to bracket her instead of the SEALs, which meant she'd pulled the threat onto herself and away from the convoy. But it also meant she was pinned and couldn't retreat without standing into their firing lanes. She moved laterally along the ridge, using the terrain to break line of sight, and swung toward the next predicted position. Her notebook said the second sniper would be east, lower elevation, covering the approach road. If she was wrong, she'd lose the angle and the remaining shooters would pin her until dawn. A probe shot rang out, not at her last position, but at where she'd be if she'd moved the predictable direction. They were good. They were adapting. She went the opposite way, farther along the ridge than made tactical sense, and caught the second shooter repositioning against the skyline for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm his silhouette against the faint star glow. She fired. The fourth sniper dropped, and the valley went quiet except for the wind. That left one. Her count said the last shooter was southwest, covering the convoy's only viable exfil route, the position that would matter most once the vehicles moved. She checked her watch. 22 minutes to first light. The convoy would roll in 20. She started moving before the enemy could reposition, using speed now instead of stealth because there was no time left for caution. The helmet cam caught her fast low crawl, the way she used her notebook to navigate without looking up, the controlled breathing that kept her steady despite the sprint. A flare popped overhead, enemy backup signaling or searching for her. The sudden light turned her night vision into a white glare, and she ripped the goggles off, relying on ambient light and memory. The flare drifted, casting shadows that moved like threats. She found the fifth position by sound, a scrape of metal on rock as the sniper adjusted his rifle. She put 2 rounds into the shadow before he could fire, then stayed frozen, waiting to see if there were more. Silence. The sniper net was broken. 5 shooters down. The convoy route was clear. Behind her, radio traffic exploded with confused chatter. Shots fired. Unknown origin. Hostile contact southwest. Multiple enemy signatures down. No friendly movement authorized. Command's voice cut through. Base, initiate breach protocol. We have an unplanned external signature. Lock down all movement until we identify the source. She started to crawl back toward her own lines, listening to them frame her as a potential security threat, knowing that every second of her unauthorized absence was being logged and time-stamped into evidence that would later be used to decide whether she'd saved lives or endangered them. The convoy rolled out 18 minutes later, exactly on schedule, through a route that would have killed them if she'd followed orders. She cleared the perimeter as the first gray light touched the horizon, rifle slung, hands visible, moving slow and deliberate so no one mistook her for a threat. The SEAL at the gate stared at her, then keyed his radio. Contact, friendly. It's her. 5 minutes later, she was sitting in the briefing tent with her rifle, notebook, and helmet cam laid out on the table in front of her. The platoon chief stood across from her, face unreadable. Behind him, 3 senior officers had arrived, including someone she didn't recognize, older, wearing a different unit patch, the kind of weathered look that came from decades of field work. "You left your post," the chief said. "Yes." "You ignored a direct order not to leave the perimeter." "Yes." "You engaged enemy targets without authorization." "Yes." He picked up her helmet cam. "And you recorded all of it." "Yes." The older officer stepped forward. "Play it." The chief hesitated. "So, we need to process this through legal before." "Play it. Now." The footage loaded onto the tent's display screen. Her sight picture, the dark terrain, the whispered count under her breath as she tracked shot intervals. The moment she left the perimeter, the slow, deliberate crawl. The first shot, perfectly timed to where the sniper would move. The cascade of engagements after, each one methodical, each one guided by the notebook she'd been mocked for carrying. The room went silent. The older officer paused the playback and picked up her notebook, flipping through pages of log patterns, angles, timestamps. He set it down and looked at the chief. "You told me this was a breach incident, an authorized movement, possibly compromised judgment. That's what the initial report. This isn't a breach. This is counter-sniper work under near-impossible conditions." He tapped the notebook. She tracked their pattern for 3 nights, predicted their coordination window, and identified the anchor position that let them operate. Then she moved on it when you wouldn't. The chief's jaw tightened. She violated SOP. "We have a standing doctrine. Do not hunt snipers at night. It's suicide. Your doctrine assumes snipers can't be hunted at night because no one has the skill or patience to learn their rhythm." The older officer gestured at the screen. "She did. And your convoy is intact because she ignored you." One of the SEALs in the back, the one who'd called her counting a nervous tick, shifted uncomfortably. She saw him glance at the footage, then at her, the same counting behavior he'd mocked now playing out in perfect sync with each engagement. The chief tried again. "She still broke orders. If we let that stand, then you'll have to explain why your orders would have killed everyone in that convoy." The older officer pulled up the operations log on his tablet, scrolling through the entries. "She submitted a report yesterday at 14:30 recommending proactive counter-sniper action. You stamped it not actionable. At 0147, she called an active sniper prep fire. You told her to log and hold. At 0203, one of your operators took a round because you sent him forward instead of addressing the threat she'd identified." The room stayed silent. At 0221, the officer continued. She stopped asking permission and started solving the problem. At 0239, the enemy sniper net collapsed. At 0258, your convoy moved through a corridor that would have been a kill zone if she'd listened to you. He closed the tablet. "So before you talk about violation of orders, you need to reckon with the fact that your orders were wrong and she was right." The chief looked at her, then at the footage still frozen on screen, then back at the officer. "What are you recommending?" "Formal review of your night engagement doctrine, because it clearly doesn't account for this level of pattern work. Classified commendation for her, because we're not going to advertise that a support attachment outperformed your entire element. And a transfer to a unit that can actually use her skills, because keeping her here as radio and intel is a waste. And the breach of orders." The officer smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You can write her up for disobedience if you want. I'll attach the convoy casualty report that would have happened without her and let higher command decide which looks wise." The formal review took 3 days. She sat through it in a windowless room while legal officers, training officers, and classification specialists picked apart her actions frame by frame. They analyzed her notebook, her helmet cam, her radio logs, the timeline of her warnings against the timeline of command decisions. The SEAL platoon chief submitted a statement acknowledging that her analysis had been accurate and that her warnings had been disregarded. He did not apologize. The younger SEAL who'd mocked her counting submitted a statement calling it the most disciplined field work I've seen and requesting permission to learn her pattern tracking method. He did apologize, privately, in the hallway after his testimony. The older officer, she learned later he was a senior instructor from the sniper school at Benning, submitted a report titled Doctrine Failure and Individual Correction, Case Study in Predictive Countersniper Operations. It included 30 pages of analysis breaking down her method, the institutional blind spots that dismissed it, and the lives saved because she'd acted anyway. At the end of the third day, the review board delivered its decision. She would receive a formal letter of reprimand for violation of movement orders to be sealed in her file. She would also receive a classified commendation for actions resulting in preservation of friendly forces under extreme operational constraints. The details of the mission would be classified. Her name would not appear in any public reports. She would be transferred to a joint task force specializing in high-risk target development, effective immediately. The SEALs would incorporate her pattern tracking methodology into updated night engagement training, attributed to an unnamed case study. The standing doctrine that no one hunts snipers in the dark would be revised to include conditional authorization for operators with demonstrated predictive capability. She signed the transfer papers without reading them. 18 months later, a group of new SEAL candidates sat in a darkened classroom at the advanced training compound, watching a blurred helmet cam clip on the screen. The footage showed a night scope view, a whispered count barely audible over controlled breathing, and a single precisely timed shot into darkness. The target, barely visible even in playback, dropped without firing. The instructor paused the video. "This is why we teach pattern recognition now," he said. Whoever this was, they didn't have better equipment than the enemy. They didn't have air support. They didn't have backup. What they had was 3 nights of log data, a notebook, and the discipline to trust their analysis over doctrine. One of the candidates raised a hand. Who was it? Classified. Why? The instructor smiled slightly. Because the system doesn't like admitting it was wrong. But it changed anyway. He restarted the clip. Someone once refused to accept that no one hunts snipers in the dark. They proved it could be done, and now you're learning how. The video played through the second engagement, then the third, each one following the same deliberate rhythm. Count, predict, fire, move. The candidates watched in silence, some taking notes, others just staring at the screen. Somewhere across the base, in a different building entirely, the woman whose footage they were watching sat alone in a planning cell, staring at a new set of patterns on a new set of targets. Her notebook, waterproof, worn at the edges, lay open beside her keyboard. The counting habit had never stopped. No one called it nervousness anymore. She logged another entry, checked the timeline, and started drafting the brief that no one would listen to until after she'd proven it was right. The pattern was familiar by now. The institution would resist, the pressure would build, the clock would run down, and eventually someone would have to act. It was almost always her. She was fine with that. The residue cost of being believed only after breaking the rules was a career path that lived in shadows, a name that stayed off public reports, and a reputation that existed only in whispered conversations and classified training slides. The price was visibility. The reward was being used correctly. She closed the notebook and checked the time. Somewhere, another convoy was being planned, another timeline locked, another doctrine assumed to be unbreakable. She started counting.